A drug so potent, the equivalent of just a few tiny grains of salt, is the only difference between a dose that kills your pain and a dose that kills you. Today I'm covering the truth behind fentanyl, its invention, how it's secretly produced, how it's trafficked across borders, and how only milligrams of this tiny powder can steal a life. Just like that. So first off, we have to give credit where credit is due. Sam did an amazing job on this book, The Least of Us. I highly recommend it, although I'm not affiliated with the author in any way. I just really respect all the work he put into this book. I'm going to do sort of the highlights that I picked up from reading this book that were the most impactful for me. I want to bring some awareness to this specific drug today, and it was requested by one of you, so here we go. Fentanyl, part 1. I will leave some resources in the description box of where a lot of this information has come from. If we're talking fentanyl, we definitely need to start with Dr. Paul Janssen. Dr. Paul Janssen was among the first to combine chemistry with pharmacology in the search of new drugs. By the time of his death in 2003, he was known as the world's greatest drug inventor. His name was on 850 scientific papers, and he, along with other scientists, created over 100 drugs that have impacted and improved our lives. Okay, hang on. Anytime I make a video, I have my little assistant Bella over here. Bella, are you going to be quiet today, or are you going to make your dog noises? So she will be licking and I'm sure snoring in the background. I'm sorry about that. Some examples are, sorry if I'm saying these wrong, levamisole, which kills hookworms and helps treat colon cancer, and also haloperidol, which calms hallucinations of schizophrenics. That drug alone freed so many patients from insane asylums. Before, they were only able to lock them up and treat them in insane asylums, and then with the invention of that new medicine that treated the hallucinations, they were able to be treated at home, which was huge. They could go home and live like a normal person. Those are just two examples. Dr. Janssen opened up Janssen Pharmaceutica. His company was highly innovative, and his company expanded worldwide, exploring things like dermatology, cardiovascular, veterinary disease, plant productions, among other subjects. In 1961, Janssen sold his company to Johnson & Johnson, but because he was the largest shareholder, he maintained control over his labs for years following. Okay, so we're in like the science-y invention part of the video now. There are timestamps in the description box if you're more interested in certain of the other subjects, but I do think it's interesting to hear like how this evolved from the very beginning, but I know not everybody is interested in the origin story, so there are timestamps if you want to skip ahead. So sort of how companies have their slogans or their taglines, what they're about. For Dr. Janssen and his laboratories, it was all about to find a molecule that had evolved to perform a job in the human or animal body, and then to alter its structure to be able to perform that job better than nature allowed. He was obsessed with discovering new painkillers, which of course led him to understand incredibly well morphine and opiates. He took notice of how drugs derived from the opium poppy seemed to fit very well on the receptors in our brain, creating effects like constipation, slower breathing, sometimes euphoria, and reduced pain. The morphine molecule found in the opium poppy works by penetrating the protective layer of fat surrounding the brain. It locks onto those receptors and it stifles feelings of pain. Dr. Janssen noticed that morphine was both slow and inefficient because about half of those morphine molecules are unable to make it past that protective fat barrier to the brain. All right, so by studying the molecular structure of morphine and other opiates, Dr. Janssen noticed a common denominator, the piperidine, this ring, which had a nitrogen atom attached. Now, By manipulating the molecule again and again and again, he was able to come up with a molecule that could make its way through the brain's protective barrier. So this new molecule also fit a lot more snug on the receptor than the morphine molecule. So here's another key difference. So we know that a large chunk of the morphine molecule doesn't make it past the brain's protective barrier. Well, heroin actually makes it past a lot more easily. But once inside the brain's tissue, heroin partially converts into morphine, which slows its absorption. Dr. Janssen's molecule crossed the barrier very effectively, and once inside, more importantly, it didn't convert into anything else. So with Dr. Janssen's new drug, 50 to 100 times less of it was needed to be more effective and faster acting than morphine. It also didn't have the same dopey after effects as morphine because it wore off sooner. This made it a great fit for surgeries because the patient could be quickly sedated, and then after the surgery, they could recover with little to no after effects, which was huge. He named the drug fentanyl. Fentanyl was a game changer in surgical anesthesia. Before this, they were using flammable gases, and patients had to be put out like unconscious to do things like coronary bypass surgery. But by putting them out, it depressed their blood pressure to dangerous levels. So in the late 1960s, medical students were shown a video of a man having stomach surgery, and he was being interviewed on camera while he was having the surgery. That was demonstrating the power of fentanyl. Patients could be conscious for surgery with normal blood pressure. Another really good benefit to fentanyl is it can be reversed with naloxone. So over the next 2 decades, Dr. Janssen went wild looking for more and more new molecules that would hit those opioid receptors no matter where they were in the body. During this process, he discovered this, which is now known as Imodium. With fentanyl, Dr. Janssen was well aware of its potential for abuse. It had the same addictive nature as heroin, the same withdrawal, the same tolerance, and the same euphoria. Because of this, Dr. Janssen only approved the use of fentanyl to anesthesiologists in limited supply in sealed glass vials in the hopes that this would limit the potential for abuse. For surgery, only minute doses of fentanyl were needed, measured in micrograms, to produce enough drowsiness and pain relief for patients. To put that in context, a microgram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. Fuck. In only slightly larger doses, it was fatal. So this was a time when doctors were not heavily prescribing opioids. They weren't giving prescriptions for patients to take home. This was being heavily scrutinized and only used in operating rooms. So fast forward a little bit later, and the restrictions in the United States were loosened up. In busy US operating rooms with little to no oversight, anesthesiologists became the first addicts to fentanyl. Now that didn't surprise me because they have access to that, and actually professions like police officers, paramedics, nurses, and especially doctors have a higher rate for addiction, believe it or not. You don't necessarily think of these people as drug addicts or alcoholics, but they have a higher rate of these things because doctors, they have access to it as well as the anesthesiologist, and they just have more opportunity to routinely and regularly abuse these drugs. And for police officers, paramedics, nurses, it's the high stress environment that is more likely to lead them to abuse something to sort of de-stress after their shift and sort of forget what they've seen. That may be kind of surprising to hear, but it does make sense. So Dr. Janssen, of course, went on experimenting, and he began creating what's called fentanyl's cousins. So drugs that are molecularly similar to fentanyl, but different enough to be considered a new drug, also known as synthesized fentanyl analogs. And chemists could create these analogs by adding and subtracting elements from the original fentanyl molecule. So in 1968, a highly informative 35-page chapter was published in an obscure anthology of studies titled drugs affecting the central nervous system. In this, Janssen listed all of the analogs of the fentanyl molecule. Many of these were more powerful than the original fentanyl, but because of their higher potency, they were a lot trickier for practical medical use. So for about the next 5 decades, Janssen's analogs and all of his discoveries remained hidden and forgotten in this old anthology, kind of tucked away in all that paperwork that was published long ago. Then in 1974, Dr. Janssen invented carfentanil, if I'm saying that right, 10,000 times more powerful than morphine. It was perfect to tranquilize large mammals like rhinoceros, elephant, and it was only approved for veterinary use. As the years went on, fentanyl became easier and easier to make, by chemists, of course. An anonymous chemist, only known as Siegfried, came out with a shorter process, a 5-step process to create fentanyl versus Janssen's 7-part process. This was published online in the early internet days. So here's where fentanyl is starting to become known to underground chemists and criminals and entrepreneurs. In the medical world, it had immediate benefits and immediate success, but it took longer for people to catch on in the drug world. They did start to take notice of its similarities to heroin, especially with its high potency. So the drug world slowly came to understand its potential. With chemistry knowledge, a drug more potent than heroin could be created in a laboratory, completely man-made, with far less risk, being produced by what is now known as the Siegfried method. And with only a modest upfront investment, it could generate insane profits. Okay, so if you're wondering how China got involved with fentanyl, in the late 70s, Janssen struck a deal with China for them to learn how to produce fentanyl, and in turn, Janssen would have access to the Chinese market, which was huge. So in 1985, Janssen opened the first Western pharmaceutical factory in China. From this point on, China had all of the knowledge and technology they needed to be able to produce fentanyl on an industrial level. So a man named Gary Henderson entered the fentanyl world by inventing a test that could test whether it was in someone's system. So this was helpful for coroners trying to determine the cause of death for an overdose. Henderson himself eventually became a member of the California Association of Toxicologists. So in 1979, he received a phone call from a coroner in Orange County who had what looked like heroin overdoses. The victims had needles in their arms, their lungs were filled with fluid, and family members were telling the same sad stories of how they abused heroin. Yet there was no trace of heroin in their systems. Word was getting around that there was a new drug, white China, which was very similar to heroin. When Henderson tested the fluids, he found fentanyl in the victims' systems. So coroners from all over California started sending him fluids when they needed him to test for fentanyl. At first, it was just once every few months. Then it became once a week. Henderson had a relatively short career dealing with fentanyl. He had 112 cases total, and of those 112 cases, he found 10 different analogs. Gary Henderson predicted, even in that short time span of working with fentanyl dust, the future drugs of abuse will be synthetics rather than plant products. Now we're jumping to 2005, and we're going to link how the city of Chicago links up with Mexico, specifically Sinaloa. Sinaloa, Mexico is the birthplace of drug trafficking in Mexico. It's home to one of the world's most dangerous cartels. When I say Mexican traffickers from here on, I'm referencing the Sinaloa cartel. So it's not new news that the Mexican traffickers were using the city of Chicago as sort of their hub for drug distribution. They focused heavily on cocaine, but also marijuana, and they overlooked what they considered a lower class drug of heroin. But the Mexican traffickers were taking notice more recently of how many Americans were being prescribed painkillers, highly addictive opiates, and then taking to the streets when they couldn't get any more from their doctors. So they saw this as a huge opportunity, and because of this, they decided to start flooding the streets with heroin. A DEA agent was working a case which he believed was a cocaine case because cocaine had been the dominant drug in Chicago for years. So this DEA agent was catching what the Mexican traffickers kept referring to as the project on the wiretaps. So the case involved a man named Chavez, who was a resident of the United States, but he originated from Mexico, and he formed a relationship with the Mexican traffickers to distribute drugs in the Chicago area. Well, they kept catching wind of this project that they were referencing. So periodically on the wiretaps, updates would come through on the project, and Chavez reported a man that he referenced as his uncle overdosed. He sniffed something and overdosed. His uncle went to the ER and was revived with naloxone. Then Chavez excitedly reported back to Mexico, "The project's working. They mixed it and it's working." So the agent started to put together that they were mixing up a new drug, experimenting with it with samples and so forth. Well, about a month later, little rashes of overdoses were appearing in the surrounding area. One day, 12 people overdosed, no survivors. So this was becoming a really concerning thing, and the authorities wanted to warn people, but when they tried to warn people, it backfired because they were putting up signs saying there's this highly potent heroin that's super dangerous and deadly. And dealers capitalized on this because, of course, drug addicts are like, highly potent, like that's what I want. So they flooded to the area, and then dealers were branding these baggies with stamps reading lethal injection or drop dead, and then people were literally dropping dead. Authorities were starting to recognize this as a really big problem, and they were taking each case and trying to figure out what was the source of it. It wasn't coming up in their system as heroin. So this new dope, whatever it was crowding out anything lesser, and overdoses were just happening in clusters, and they were treating each case like sharing information across precincts, trying to figure out what was the cause of all these deaths. It was spreading from Chicago to Detroit to Philadelphia and other eastern cities, and they were trying to share information to figure out what was the culprit behind it. It was still very mysterious. Then something kind of crazy happened. A Mexican came in off of the street divulging that there was a lab near Mexico City that was creating synthetic heroin, and he knew it to be the source of all these deaths in the United States, in Chicago particularly. So after the DEA agent chased down that lead to the lab, he found it pointed right back to Chavez and the Mexican traffickers and their secret project they were working on. Now, the authorities had another strike of good luck because a man fled for his life from Toluca, Mexico, about an hour away from Mexico City. He became an informant and let the police know that he was hired to work in a laboratory that seemed like a legitimate business. They were producing high quality glassware, tubes, and machines. The informant learned that because of the legitimacy of the business, it allowed them to acquire chemicals used to create precursors for drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl. This was all funded by the Sinaloa cartel. The lab was producing ephedrine along with synthetic heroin, and this synthetic heroin could be cut up to 50 times and still sell. The DEA agent had never heard once of a drug so powerful it could be diluted 30 times and still sell. He was in disbelief. But the Mexican was adamant on, this is what's happening, this is what's true. So they found a man that was nicknamed the Brain was the lead chemist running this lab. Well, the lab was really run by the cartel, but he was the lead chemist in producing what the cartel needed. They hired him to produce ephedrine because it's an essential chemical in the production of methamphetamine. But the Mexican government was heavily regulating ephedrine being imported, so they were making it in this lab. Well, the brain had other plans. He knew how to, and he wanted to make fentanyl, so he started making fentanyl too. And the first investor to the lab also took notice of this huge opportunity with fentanyl. And it wasn't long before the cartel caught on to the potential. And that's how the man that was informing them of all this fled from the lab, because the cartel killed everybody except for the brain and stole all the fentanyl. The DEA agent noted this was sort of a turning point in the drug world, because prior to this, there would be once in a while like a rogue chemist that would manufacture something and it would kill people, and then it would sort of fizzle out as quickly as it came into the market. But this was the first time they heard of Mexican traffickers, specifically the cartel, had come across the opportunity of fentanyl. And this was the first time they had even heard of Mexican traffickers selling it. And not only were they selling it, they were creating it entirely from scratch. So that marked a time where fentanyl was no longer this exclusive drug that only a few rogue chemists could create. That lab that the informant fled from was estimated to have had on hand enough ingredients to produce another 60 kilos of fentanyl. If 60 kilos of fentanyl is enough to make millions of street doses, and there were millions of Americans fiending for opiates, it's because they were prepped by big pharma and doctors doling out left and right prescriptions for any kind of pain, surgery, injuries, that primed them for an addiction to opiates. And the traffickers were ready to capitalize on this opportunity. This explained why all of the sudden deaths would soon spread from Chicago to cities like New Jersey and St. Louis. Alright, so I'm going to get to work on the next fentanyl video. In the meantime, here's another video inspired by the same book, The Least of Us, by Sam Quiones. Highly recommend. And here's that video right here if you're interested.